Happy Thursday. The scene we're reading today plays out like the best courtroom dramas that you will see on all of the cable shows. This is like a square down between Paul and the Sanhedrin and the Roman forces, and everybody's got political things at stake, emotional things at stake. So let's just look at the story. The Sanhedrin have hired this lawyer, essentially, that they have to deliver the case against Paul to the Roman governor at the time. His name is Felix. He's like the successor to Pontius Pilate, and he's going to accuse Paul of 3 things. But before he does what all lawyers do. He's going to butter up Felix a little bit first. He says, "Most excellent Felix." He starts talking about how there's been peace and prosperity under his reign, which is all a total you-know-what. Felix had not been necessarily very popular. He had not been doing a lot to foster peace. Some believe that Israel and Rome at this point is on the point of rebellion. The Jews are not happy. There are riots like on the verge of breaking out. So he's just buttering him up basically at this point. And then he gets into the meat of his argument, and he's going to accuse Paul of 3 things. This is in verse 5 of 24. He says, "We have found this man to be like a plague." The NIV uses a different word, but the word plague here in the ESV that I'm reading out of captures the idea of his teachings are infectious, and not necessarily in a good way. He's infecting our community. And he describes that with the second thing. He's stirring up riots, not just among the Jews, but throughout the world. This man is going around with his infectious beliefs, and he's stirring up riots. This lawyer knows exactly what he's doing. Felix is charged by Caesar, the Roman authorities, to keep the peace in this region. And so he's going to be particularly interested in anyone who threatens that peace, because his life is on the line. And so this lawyer, he just pushes all the right buttons. He's a plague. He's stirring up riots among the Jews and all over the world. And the last is my personal favorite. He says he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. This is the only time in the New Testament where Christians are called the Nazarenes. And it's not meant to be a positive connotation. You probably remember in the Gospels we've read about the time where they say, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" particularly in Matthew's gospel. And the idea is Nazareth is like the equivalent of what we would call, where I'm from in North Carolina, a podunk town. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's not got a lot going on for it. You know what I'm saying? So he's essentially saying, like, these guys, they're from nowhere. They're no one important. Their ringleader who represents their whole group comes from Nazareth. Can anything good come from Nazareth? These are a bunch of no good hillbillies is like the force of what he's saying. He's strategically demeaning them in the eyes of Felix, which is why we don't see this done anywhere else in the New Testament. Paul then gets a chance to argue his case. He's going to refute every argument. You'll read about it today. And then I want to get to the end. What is Felix going to do? He is kind of caught in this rock and a hard place. If he lets Paul go, because there's not really a lot of evidence against Paul, the case is not all that strong. If he lets Paul go, he risks angering the Jewish leaders, and they're already unhappy with him. They're already on the verge of revolt. That could be a real problem for him. But at the same time, Paul is a Roman citizen. He has rights. And if he disregards those rights, he risks angering a whole nother group of people. So this is a delicate situation that Felix, the governor in this region, has gotten himself into. So what would you do? He kicks the can down the road. Yeah. Paul will sit in prison. We'll deal with this later when Lysis is here, is essentially what he does. And here's where I think there's a lesson in this for us at the end of this section, starting in verse 23. It says, he gave orders, this is Felix, to the centurion, the soldiers, that he should be, Paul, kept in custody, but have some liberty as a Roman citizen. None of his friends should be kept from attending to all his needs. So if you were a prisoner in this day and age, in this region, you were kept under lock and key, but you weren't given food and water. If you were going to eat and drink, your friends, your community was going to have to bring everything that you would need to you. And so for 2 years, Paul is going to sit in prison. He, as a Roman citizen, is given the same rights that any other Roman citizen would be given. But now he is completely dependent upon his community, upon his friends who are going to be bringing him things to eat, things to drink, papers to write letters, because we know Paul writes a lot of letters while he's in prison. And I find that so fascinating today, because if you think about your community or your tribe of people surrounding you, if you were put in prison, in the Roman prison, where your needs were completely dependent upon your people, how would you survive? Would you make it? This is a big question for me. I'm wondering, like, who would come to your aid? Who would be the ones bringing you food and water? And if the situation were reversed, who would you make sure, if they were in prison, that you were taking care of them every single day? I think this is a practical reminder for me that people lived in these tight communities where they shared everything in common and really cared for one another. What would that look like in our world today, in your life, in my life, to have that kind of tight community? If you don't feel like you have that, that's something that we all need. We cannot do life alone. Paul would not be able to survive in prison alone without that community around him. So that, I hope, is what you're thinking about this week. Who is your community? And if you don't feel like you have that community, it's time to start finding that. If you want help, email me, Matt, Hannah, Elizabeth. We would love to help you find that kind of community. It's not built overnight. It takes a long time to foster that kind of close-knit family who's caring for one another, but we cannot survive without it. Here's the second thing that this passage makes me think of. Paul is going to be in prison for 2 years at this point in time. For 2 years, he's going to sit until the next governor comes along. We'll read about that tomorrow. But in the meantime, what do you think he's thinking? I wonder if we would think, like, has God abandoned me? Is God just off doing something else? I guess God doesn't care about me anymore. And it's a reminder that God has promised Paul that he's going to go to Rome. So we know God hasn't abandoned Paul. But to Paul, maybe it feels that way. Are there things that you're waiting for in your life? Are you at a place where you feel like you're stuck, where you're waiting for something to happen and you're caught in limbo and you're not sure what's going to come or when it's going to come, and maybe you feel like you don't even know where God is in the midst of that? One of the things that Matt said a long time ago that this passage reminds me of is, while we're waiting, God is working. And I just want to challenge you today to spend some time thinking about that. Do you believe that in your life? What are you waiting on? And do you believe that while you are waiting, while you're sitting in this unknown place and not sure what the next day will bring, do you believe that God is still working, that God is still with you? Amen.